Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Welcome to another edition of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Adrian Garcia, Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Property Division for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to obtain safe, healthy, affordable housing free from barriers brought about by discrimination takes a collaborative approach. Sure, there are laws to prohibit illegal discrimination based on protected categories, but that only represents the reactive segment of the Fair Housing Act. It does little to address the systemic barriers that were put in place years ago, which made it necessary to enact those protections. But the Fair Housing Act has a second goal, which is to desegregate neighborhoods or to take meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunities based on protected characteristics. I know, this sounds technical and difficult to do, and it is. That's why it takes a collaborative approach between federal, states, municipal governments, but it also takes assistance from organizations, housing advocates, social service entities, lending institutions, and housing providers to make fair housing a reality for all across the Commonwealth. Our guests today represent the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania, a statewide organization that provides leadership and a common voice for policies, practices, and resources to ensure that all Pennsylvanians, especially those with low incomes, have access to safe, decent, affordable homes. They promote common sense solutions to balance Pennsylvania's housing market and increase supply of safe, decent homes for low-income people. Joining us today are Phyllis Chamberlain, Executive Director of the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. And Phyllis has over 25 years of experience in public policy advocacy, community engagement, and communications, with most of her time spent on local, state, and federal planning and policies to increase affordable housing opportunities and end homelessness. She is driven by her passion for the role that housing plays in providing a safe and stable foundation for vulnerable people, as well as the knowledge that there are practical solutions to the problems of affordable housing and homelessness. And Gail Schwartz, Associate Director of Policy and Programs for the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania, she engages in diverse membership of the Housing Alliance to advocate for programs and resources to expand the supply of affordable housing, solve homelessness, and prevent eviction at local, state, and federal levels. In recent years, her work has focused on promoting promising practices for landlord engagement, eviction prevention and diversion, and emergency rental assistance. In addition, she develops ongoing educational content for the Housing Alliance webinars and annual Homes Within Reach conference. And so today, we want to welcome them both to PHRC Speaks. Welcome, ladies, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, so I said a mouthful. You guys are doing a lot, and I've only touched the tip of the iceberg of everything that you do. But let's start off explaining to our viewers, just kind of in a broad stroke, and either of you could take this question, what is the Housing Alliance? I mentioned some of it, but I know you do a lot more.
Sure, well, I'll take that question. So here at the Housing Alliance, our goal is to make a home safe, decent, and affordable, because home is really where everything starts. Housing is a basic need, and if you don't have a safe, decent, and affordable home, your quality of life suffers. So we think there are three things that need to happen to meet that goal of making a home safe, decent, and affordable. One is money and resources, more of it. Two is different program models and strategies at the local level. And three is voices and input. So to explain just a little bit more, first, money and resources. So the market doesn't create housing that's affordable, especially for those at the very lowest incomes. So we need incentives and subsidies to fill that gap between what a family earns and what it takes to afford housing. So we advocate for more funding and for better public policy with a focus at the state level. Then two, program strategies and program models. Money is not always the answer to all problems. And sometimes the way that you're delivering those programs and those services matters just as much. So we explore and research and promote smart best practices that are achieving really great outcomes in helping more families have affordable housing. And third, voices and input. We convene and listen to two groups of people who've lived the problem of homelessness, housing instability, and/or poverty, and those who are delivering the assistance. Because it's their experiences, those who are closest to the problem, that make for good policies and good programs. And without it, policies and programs just aren't as good. So that's what we do, and a little bit of why we do it.
Appreciate it. And you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question, because I always ask this question. And because this is a very specific kind of a branch that we all embark upon, this housing industry. What first sparked that interest for you? I'm going to ask the same question of Gail in a moment, but what first sparked that interest? How did you know that this was your calling and that this is what you wanted to do?
So for me, it's really a question about fairness and justice, that where you grow up, the neighborhood that you live in really has a huge impact on your ability to achieve your life goals and dreams. And it just doesn't seem fair to me that some people don't have affordable housing. In my life, I've been really lucky and honestly very privileged. And other people really need some help and really need that same opportunity that I was afforded. So for me, it's just really about fairness and justice.
Very good. And Gail, let me ask you the same question. Where does that spark come from? When did you first discover that this is what I want to do, this is worth doing?
Yeah, I think, very similar to Phyllis, it's definitely about fairness and justice. I am somebody who had a bit of a up and down childhood where, I most certainly was born in an affluent community and had great resources, and then experienced what is, situational poverty, which I was then lifted out of by government assistance. But it was the socially acceptable form of government assistance because it was survivors' benefits from Social Security because my father passed away. And so for me, I know what government funding can do. It allowed us to live in a house with a yard. I got to have a dog. I went to 3 different elementary schools by second grade. And so now I was stable, and it really made a difference. And nobody ever looked down on me for it. But I see, having gone into social services and always just being drawn to that field of, these people are no different than what I experienced. And we know that resources, whether it is housing assistance, whether it is direct financial assistance, when we address people's basic needs and make sure that they are secure and stable, the sky is the limits. And so that's really kind of where it comes from for me.
Thank you. And now, Gail, I want to ask you, share a little bit about some of the policy work. I was reading that on the website, and people may know in abstract. Maybe they attended the Homes Within Reach conference that happens, but that's it. They don't really know that you guys really go to bat for safe, healthy, affordable housing. Tell us a little bit about that work.
Yeah, so I've been with the Housing Alliance almost 10 years now, and it's just really amazing to see the different policies that really help establish the building blocks for communities to do some really, really powerful things. The Housing Alliance helped created and increased funding for the State Housing Trust Fund, which has innovated so many different types of programs all across the state that have helped a wide breadth of people. Of course, we're always looking at how can we get any amount of resources to help with the development of affordable housing. And so looking at the state housing tax credit, and we had that created a couple of years ago. And of course, with the pandemic, and really making sure that these resources were not only making it to communities quickly, but that it was in a way that could be most impactful and reach those in the greatest need as quickly as possible.
With regards to policy, how, you said you've been there 10 years, Gail, and Phyllis, you can jump in here as well. How receptive on the legislative end have you found Pennsylvania to be? Because I come from, we obviously have a responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing. That's a mandate. And policies is a good way to move some of those initiatives forward. So how has that been in the 10 years you've been working there? And Phyllis, in your experience working there, tell me how that's been for you.
I think it depends on the policy, and I think it just depends on what matters most to people. Housing is a common denominator, but maybe your reason for prioritizing it is different. So, I think we found great bipartisan support on issues of blight. We had great bipartisan support anytime that we went to establish FAIR, the State Housing Trust Fund, and increase funding for it. So I think it's just recognizing that there's a lot of different reasons for caring and making sure that you're able to tap into that and elevate those reasons depending on who you're talking to on what side of the aisle or what house they're in.
That's fair. That's fair. Phyllis, did you want to add anything to that? Or
I'll reinforce something that Gail said, and then I will add to it. So on the State Housing Trust Fund, or FAIR is the acronym, there really has been incredible bipartisan support that led to the creation of the program in 2015, and then led to subsequent funding increases, including just last year. And starting in July, we're up to $60 million for the State Housing Trust Fund. So it really has been very much a bipartisan priority. I'd also say that given the impacts of the pandemic, that we're seeing more and more communities talk about the problem of affordable housing. And that's in communities all across Pennsylvania that has both Democratic and Republican legislators. So, I hate to say anything good happened because of the pandemic, right? Because it was terrible for so many reasons. But I do think that all the conversation about what happened to housing costs and prices during the pandemic has really resulted in a lot of really healthy conversations, which will probably lead to some good legislation and even more bipartisan support.
No, that's fair. We could all agree that the housing challenges that we were facing when the pandemic started, it basically brought those to the surface, and we realized that those individuals that were at a disadvantage were further disadvantaged. And so my question to either of you is, with the abundance of housing challenges that exist, how does the Housing Alliance prioritize its policy and advocacy work? Because it's got to be hard. We need everything and we need it now. But how do we prioritize?
It is hard, and it's definitely more an art than a science, but there are a few things we do take into account. So first, we work with people and organizations all across the state, and we're talking to them all the time. And out of those conversations, which are sometimes formal and sometimes informal, we figure out, okay, well, what are some of the common challenges? And then is there a state level solution? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. And a state level solution might be that it's a change in a policy or it's a new policy. Sometimes it's not a policy solution, but it's promoting a new way of doing something or a new program. So that's one way that we figure out our priorities. And then, of course, it's all about partnerships and opportunities. So then we look at, well, for particularly the decision makers, the policy makers, is there an issue that they care about that if we work together, we could really get something done? So again, an art, not a science, but that's what we take into consideration when we figure out our priorities.
Sure. And so I know we've kind of delved into policy, but let's talk about some of the other programs. What other programs does the Housing Alliance manage?
Yeah, so we most certainly have our educational programming, our webinars, and our Homes Within Reach conference. We currently do provide some, technical assistance to communities around blight. We are doing some work with a couple of communities around landlord engagement and landlord incentives, and trying to better understand what landlord incentives are going to work in the post-pandemic market. We're doing a lot of work around eviction prevention, of course, studying evictions, and what the statewide eviction data on filings is telling us, as well as, working with communities to see if we can start to get local programs started, local pilots, really strengthening partnerships between courts and local service providers, whether it's, a mediation program or, expanded legal access. We also have civic engagement programming. So we've been doing a lot around voter engagement the past couple of years. And then, of course, just general civic engagement where, we really are prioritizing of just getting out into different communities all across the state and just meeting directly with people to hear about their experiences. That's our Listen and Act for Help and Housing initiative.
I was intrigued, before I get into the reports that you did on eviction, I was intrigued by the values in the value statement, particularly the statement that says cultural humility. Can you share with our viewers what that means for you? Either of you can answer that question, but why was it important to put that in there?
Yeah, so I think for us, we really want to acknowledge that not everyone starts in the same place with the same opportunities, and that we want to create an adaptive and equitable culture by centering our mission, our functions, our activities to elevate communities' uniqueness, especially with great consideration to marginalized communities, and address them in a fair and just manner and engage in meaningful participation and leadership. So, what that means for us as a staff is, we're really striving to acknowledge the power imbalances and mitigating those imbalances, just being open and a willingness to learn from people from all different backgrounds and expertise, a commitment to self-reflection and really examining our own biases that we may be bringing with us into the work, empathy, compassion, and really making sure that we're doing everything we can to center, communities that we are really trying to assist and help. So, going back to what Phyllis talked about earlier, we're continually engaging with our memberships, whether we're doing it formal and informal ways. We join meetings at the local level. We also convene meetings from people all across the state. We are always looking for feedback in many different ways. We might, convene a peer learning group or a community of practice around, some new development. And of course, again, just really getting out into the community as much as possible and making sure that we are speaking directly to the people who are in need of these services, are accessing these services, and are, benefiting from affordable housing so that we can expand what's working.
I want to turn our focus on your eviction prevention. I understand that the Housing Alliance had produced 2 reports on this issue. What can you share regarding these reports, and how will these reports lead your efforts in this space?
Yeah, I think, for what we know about eviction, there's what we all know in our everyday communities. And then I think what we've been able to do with this work is really put a spotlight on it and, help show the scale and also where eviction is concentrated. And so it really kind of helped map and visualize and put scope and scale to the problem in a different way. But, what we learned in these two programs is, one, we have far too many evictions happening. We know that we're seeing a disproportionate amount of people of color, as well as female-headed households. Single female-headed households are, greatly impacted by eviction. And we're also seeing what works. And that's the really great part. We are able to highlight two programs in particular in Chester County and Berks County that were able to really make a dramatic impact in what was happening in courts there. So what we saw with these eviction diversion programs, where it combined expanded legal access, legal assistance, close coordination with other services, rental assistance, and of course, just, combining good quality outreach to landlords and tenants. We saw in these communities that, more cases were being withdrawn or settled. And, we take that as meaning that people are coming to solutions that are not necessarily having the tenant locked out and the landlord never again recouping the rental income loss. So we're seeing solutions that are beneficial to both sides. And, when we talk to people about these programs, and all of this is in our reports, we are learning that, the tenants really felt a power imbalance when it came to going into courts, and that this really helped level the playing field. It really helped even motivate people to show up and contest the eviction and actually engage in that solutions-oriented dialogue with their landlord. It reopened the lines of communication, and, we saw a reduction in orders of possession issued. So that means that's the last phase of the eviction process, where people might actually get truly locked out. So we saw that decrease. We started to see evidence in Chester County that in the courts where eviction diversion is happening, they're actually starting to see decreases in filings in the first place. And what we're hearing from the people on the ground is that they've earned the trust of the landlords. And so landlords are not going to the court. They're going to these programs first. And that's what we want. We want different tools in the toolbox so that landlords don't feel like their only option is eviction. And so that is really what we looked at in these reports. And we took, a deep dive into what the data is telling us statewide. And we took a really deep dive into these examples of programs that started during the pandemic that made a real impact in real communities.
Yeah, that dovetails nicely into my final question. Phyllis, what lessons do you think we learned from the pandemic? Are there any questions that you believe helped families during the pandemic that should remain in place, right? That aren't considered Band-Aid programs, but programs that could have legs and could be long-standing?
So because of the pandemic and because of the concern that there was going to be a massive eviction crisis, and because of the resources that the federal government made available, there were all of these eviction prevention programs that popped up across the state. And I would say that before the pandemic, eviction prevention was not really a community-wide focus like other housing issues. They don't get enough attention, but they got more attention than that issue. Mm-hmm. And I think that there were landlord-tenant mediation programs, there were rental assistance programs, there were programs to provide day of legal representation that really did so much to help the family not be evicted, and those programs should continue. I'd also say that because the pandemic was such an emergency, there was a lot more focus, and in some case, funding requirements, that the barriers to accessing that assistance be lowered so that families could get help immediately. And I think we need to take a real good look at what were those barriers that got removed, and how can we make sure that they are in future programs? Because I think sometimes a focus on preventing fraud ends up that there's so many rules that the people who really need the assistance, they can't get it because there's so many documentation requirements and other things. So I would say that's another big lesson learned, is how do we make the programs easier to access? Of course, for tenants and renters, but also for landlords who might also need that rental assistance to help keep their tenant in the home.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us on PHRC Speaks. We look forward to hearing more about the great work that the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania is doing across the Commonwealth. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to thank you, the viewer, for joining us today. For more information on this topic, or if you believe that you've been a victim of discrimination in a housing transaction, visit us online at www.phrc.pa.gov or call us at 717-787-9780. We're also pretty easy to find online on Facebook at PA Human Relations and on Twitter at PA_HumRelpCom. That's going to do it for this edition of PHRC Speaks. Until next time, take care, be good, and be fair to each other.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.